Welcome to the Holy Post. Steve Bezner, a pastor in Houston, had a troubling realization. His people were being shaped more by social media, YouTube, and cable news than by the Bible, and their views of money, sex, and power looked way more American than Christian. He talks with Caitlin this week about his new book, Your Jesus is Too American, and how being more relational than organizational may be the first step toward healing our churches. Also this week, are American evangelicals going through the 5 stages of grief? And if so, what does it mean for us to accept our loss of cultural influence? And for the first time, new data says that Gen Z men are more religious than Gen Z women. Why are young women leaving the church, and why are young men coming? Plus, gorillas are addicted to smartphones. I've got 2 announcements before today's show. First, we are recording an upcoming Holy Post episode live with a studio audience here in Chicago on October 12th. It will be me, Caitlin, and Phil, along with our special guest, Pastor Charlie Dates. If you'd like to be part of the live taping, be sure to get a ticket today at holypost.com/events. And second, Holy Post Media is producing a series of explainer videos leading up to the election. Each video deals with an issue or misunderstanding related to how Christians engage the public square, and they feature some of your favorite Holy Post Media voices, like Caitlin Chess, Esau McCauley, David French, Karen Swallow Pryor, and of course, me and Phil. So head over to our YouTube channel to watch all of those videos, and help us to make more of these kinds of videos by sharing them on your social media feeds. Okay, here is Holy Post episode 637.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I'm here with 2 charming and delightful people, bubbly personalities, both of them, dressed suitably, one all in black. Okay, I'm here with Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Phil.
What's that? What's the pattern? Is that paisley?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind
it's
of
like a
paisley?
form of paisley.
Yeah. Paisley? Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, I am not the one in all black. Everyone was shocked to discover.
And Sky Jatani, who is dressed in black.
Okay, Phil.
Man in black.
Have you not looked at yourself? Are you
charcoal gray?
aware of the kettle and the pot here?
Charcoal.
Quite literally.
Gray. Heather gray, if you look on the tag when you buy one of these delightful t-shirts at Kohl's with your Kohl's cash. Heather.
I don't have taco ready for this, Phil.
What's so funny, Caitlin?
Kohl's cash.
Yeah. That's somebody said in the apocalypse. That's the only currency that's still going to work is Kohl's cash. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Caitlin. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends at Zondervan Publishing and the NIV Upside Down Kingdom Bible. God calls believers to live faithfully in a way that flips the wisdom of worldly kingdoms on its head. In a culture that has become wildly polarized, it can be difficult to think deeply and love widely. The NIV Upside Down Kingdom Bible provides readers with thoughtful, scripture-based notes from a diverse set of trusted Christian voices and explores difficult issues facing Christianity today with features that are honest, nuanced, and filled with grace. The NIV Upside Down Kingdom Bible provides hundreds of side column notes, full-page articles, essays, and book introductions that skillfully and thoughtfully address topics such as race and ethnicity, creation care, science, abortion, wealth and poverty, gender and sexuality, politics, baptism, technology, and more. You can buy your copy of the NIV Upside Down Kingdom Bible at upsidedownkingdombible.com or wherever books and Bibles are sold. The Holy Post is sponsored by BioLogos and the Language of God podcast. We all come into contact with hard questions that don't have simple answers. We want to bring both science and Christian faith into engagement with these hard questions, not necessarily to find simple answers, but to grow through the process of exploration. That's what BioLogos and the Language of God podcast are all about. Language of God is a podcast about science and faith from BioLogos that dives deep into complex issues through interviews and storytelling. The podcast explores questions like, what does it mean to to be human? How should we respond to the climate crisis? How are we changed by technology? Featuring the voices of experts and thinkers, scientists and theologians, and several Holy Post guests like Jonathan Haidt, Esau McCauley, Curtis Chang, N.T. Wright, John Walton, and even me. Check out the Language of God podcast on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Oh, that was for Kohl's. That ding was for Kohl's. I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See, I have simplified my life, and you might want to follow this. I have simplified my life. When I need new clothes, I restrict myself to what I can find at Kohl's that works for me. And I just don't bother looking anywhere else. Because then it forces me to either wear some kind of dorky stuff or really go to the basics. The basics, a heather gray t-shirt, for example. And that makes my life so much easier on the decision chain, because when we have more decisions, we get stressed about all the decisions we have to make. When we have fewer decisions, we're happier people. That's why I'm so happy. I don't know why it isn't working for Sky, because he only wears the same thing. What?
Isn't this the Steve Jobs philosophy of wardrobe?
It's true.
Yeah, and I believe also Albert Einstein, who had 5 of the same suit. And he was next one on the
known
rack.
for his fashion sense.
He's an icon. He is a fashion icon. Okay, we got some troubling news from out west. Troubling. We talk a lot about, we had Jonathan Haidt on. We talk a lot about screen time, about phones messing with the children. Phones are also messing with the gorillas. Gorillas at the San Diego Zoo are getting too much screen time. This is an official complaint from the zookeepers of the San Diego Zoo.
What screens do they have?
Zoo officials in San Diego and across the country aren't thrilled with a new trend of visitors showing videos to gorillas.
What?
Of the gorillas themselves. If you visited the gorilla compound at the San Diego Zoo recently, you've seen the regulars, quote unquote, decked out in homemade gorilla merchandise, standing by the glass, ready to show the apes videos of themselves and their families. The gorillas clearly recognize themselves, often abandoning play to bound over to the glass and gesture with their hands to see a phone. And then they just stand there, hypnotized, watching videos of themselves. Zookeepers are concerned. Gorillas should act like gorillas. Guests, this is one gorilla. This is one gorilla talking. This is one zookeeper talking. Guests should watch gorillas behave like gorillas. So gorillas, like people, should limit their screen time.
I think it's fascinating that we are taking our maladies and transferring them to other species.
Yeah. Hey, gorillas, here's a cell phone and here's diabetes. Have fun.
Well, and it's not just the screens. It's that they want to show them videos of themselves. Like we're spreading our narcissism.
And the gorillas can recognize themselves. Hey, that's me.
I mean, interesting.
Hey, that one's me. Hey, there's my uncle. Hey, there's my cousin. What are we doing? Ooh, show me that again.
It's kind of like when you're at a sporting event and they do the fan cam. And they go into the crowd and you see yourself on the big Jumbotron and everyone goes nuts.
And you start acting like a gorilla. Like
exactly.
A monkey.
Wow.
So phones not only are destroying the human race, they're destroying the animal kingdom as well. What if we released a certain number of cell phones into the wild, like for just monkeys to pick up and start using, and we'd see how they use them? Would it accelerate?
That sounds like the beginning of a sci-fi apocalyptic movie.
Would it accelerate evolution, do you think?
Actually, it would probably help our species because it would make those others dumber. Right? We would have less competition.
A chimpanzee is less likely to bite my nose off, or
that's
more
actually
likely?
That's an interesting point, Sky. I was assuming they would get them and learn things and come and, take us over. But no, you're right. They probably, the world would be worse and they would be worse.
Yeah. And what would the algorithms learn to feed up to gorillas on Facebook?
Probably other gorillas.
Other gorillas or just banana cartoons?
I don't
know. Or
know,
banana cartoons.
Like, I think it'd be interesting if someone made a sci-fi movie about like our modern technology actually being given to us by aliens, I don't know, back during World War II or something, knowing that it would evolve, that it would suppress the advancement of our species so that they could more easily take us over.
Have you ever watched the movie Time Bandits, the classic Terry Gilliam children's film made in 1979, I think?
Are you watching the new series?
Yeah, it's not so good.
Yeah, I watched the first episode and I was like,
yeah, it didn't really, and they've already canceled it. There will be no second season of the new Time Bandits that Taika Waititi made. Anyway, didn't work out. That's okay. Nice try, Taika. Go make another Thor. My point is, at the center of the universe in Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits was the supreme evil being. The supreme evil being was trying to learn he was trying to learn technology. And his argument was, God doesn't care about this stuff. So this is my advantage. This is my window of opportunity. And he said, I'm trying to understand microwave ovens. And some of his minions said, why, sir? Why microwave ovens? And he says, because if I can understand the microwave, then I can understand the digital watch. And if I can understand the digital watch, then I can understand the computer. And then I will be God. Pretty profound. Pretty deep. Wow, you guys are just in stun.
Caitlin,
stunned.
I have no context for this story. And also, I mean, wouldn't the same be true then as well? Like, would you actually have all power, or would you just be dumber too?
Yeah, well, he never got to make a sequel, so we don't know. And the new series on Apple Plus is not a sequel, so it doesn't tell us anything more about that. Are we at the acceptance stage of lost evangelical influence? This from Christianity Today a few weeks ago. It was on my list, but we kept coming up with other stuff to talk about. So I'm finally getting to this. In the past 25 years, an estimated 40 million Americans have stopped attending church. Once dominant and uncontested, Christianity is increasingly one moral vision among many. How are evangelicals responding to the decline of Christianity's cultural and political power? And we kind of know how that's going. Some evangelicals are not grieving at all. They actually celebrate Christianity's loss of power. In other words, it's toxic to have power, so let's celebrate our lack of power. Yay! And the author, who's the author? Let's look. I forget
Matthew K. Mink.
Matthew K. Mink. Oh yeah, his last name is interesting. Spell it for us, Caitlin. That's interesting.
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but he's a brilliant theologian at Fuller.
It ends in NGK.
Yes.
So bonus points just for that. That's wild. He says, while I sympathize with their sentiments, I must object. We must actively seek public justice and mercy. We must vigorously work for the flourishing of our neighbors. This requires us to be involved in politics and exert some level of political power and influence toward these ends. Privileged Christians who wish to politically disengage are abandoning the very neighbors they're commanded to protect, serve, and love. Okay, are we in agreement on that, my esteemed panel of experts?
Yes.
Okay. We're in agreement on that. Of course, there's the other side that says, we got to take over. We got to exert dominion. We got to get our power back. And gets very angry. So he compares this to going through the stages of grief. He says the first stage of grief is denial. While some evangelicals are still in denial over the decline of Christianity, their numbers are dwindling by the day. The second stage is anger. Evangelical rage makes for great TV. Infantile evangelical leaders coming unhinged attracts a lot of clicks. It is thus no surprise that the bulk of media attention has been trained on evangelical fits of outrage, victimhood, and lament. Agree? Disagree?
Totally agree. And can I just say that I wrote a piece probably more than a decade ago arguing that evangelicalism was going through the 5 stages of grief.
Really?
And yeah.
And do we think Mr. Lamink got a hold of it and just kept it quiet on the side?
His is longer, more thoughtful, and smarter.
Oh, come on.
I just want to know that, it is. It's very good.
You're selling yourself short.
He's right, Phil.
Okay. Did you read both? Did you read both side by side?
No, but I feel pretty confident in my judgment.
Okay. The third stage is bargaining. the disastrous ways in which evangelical leaders are increasingly willing to make a devil's bargain for a few scraps of political power and access. Okay, bargaining. Maybe I can be the president's spiritual advisor, and I can pray down angels from Africa to save him.
I think bargaining would actually be more, I'm willing to give up on these Christian values and convictions in order to have a seat at the table so that I can still have some influence. That's the bargaining part.
You are correct. He asks, what might it look like for American evangelicals to step into a state of acceptance? He says, I'm an evangelical who believes that American Christianity should adopt a form of non-passive acceptance. Non-passive acceptance. How might evangelicals progress through this grieving process? At least 5 things that we need. He's got 5 things that we need to move through the whole process, get over it, and adopt a form of non-passive acceptance. Non-passive. Not resistance. Acceptance. Interesting. Yes, Sky?
Yeah, I just think it would be interesting if he included some viewpoint from people with evangelical theological beliefs who are not going through these stages because they didn't have anything to lose in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know what I mean?
that's not who he's talking to, Sky.
I know, but like we have a lot of sisters and brothers from other mothers.
Like did not have political power.
Right. They didn't have tons of political or
Yeah.
cultural power, but they still hold to Christian convictions that can show us how to do that. That was my point.
That is very true. And also, I think one of the most helpful things about this article is acknowledging that, because a lot of us who think you shouldn't respond to this loss of power, or sometimes perceived loss of power, like there is a real loss of influence, and then there's like other things that aren't really lost, but we perceive them to be lost. Some of us want to respond to the like grasping for those last crumbs with, you shouldn't care at all. Like you shouldn't feel anything. I mean, I think his point is really important that there are good reasons to wield political power on behalf of good things, which I think we can lose sight of when we're so busy saying we should lose political power, like he points out. But I also think just on like the emotional, spiritual side of things, what I loved about this piece was there's a pastoral responsibility here too, to say, this just came up in my church last week with some things going on in our city. The ability to say, you're not persecuted. Like, that's very important. Your perceived loss of power and even your real loss of power is not akin to persecution. And yet to say, it is okay to grieve something. It's okay to have yourself feel unsteady in a world that is different than you expected to live in. And while, Sky, you're 100% right, we need to learn from people who never had that power to begin with. Sometimes I think we jump too quickly to that and don't first say, there is some grief that has to be dealt with. There is some feelings that have to be processed. And if you don't do that, you might think you've moved past it really quickly, and you actually haven't. That's true, like interpersonally. And I also think it's true for evangelicalism more broadly. We'll make mistakes if we move past it too quickly.
Oh, that's good. That's what she said. Okay, five changes we need. The first is a change in theology. Who's in charge is the central question in political philosophy. The answer, of course, is Jesus. Too many American evangelicals are trying to white-knuckle a political steering wheel that does not belong to them, that they do not, cannot, and should not be in control of. We must learn to place our trust in the political sovereignty of Jesus. Okay? Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, that's come up a lot on this show. Totally agree.
Fabulous.
Caitlin gave it 2 thumbs up.
Yep.
Second, tactical change. As evangelicals accept their status as a political minority, they will need to learn how to play with others. What? No! No! How can you play with others if you're right and they're wrong?
I think this may have been the most interesting point. Not that I agreed with all of them, but this I thought was really interesting because he's totally right. As we have less cultural and political power, we need to partner with others who kind of, make for strange bedfellows when we want to achieve something. But he's advocating that at the very time when so many Christians are willing to destroy fellow Christians for partnering with people they think are unworthy to partner with. It's self-defeating, in other words. Yes, we need to carry this more coalition kind of posture into all the problems our world is facing. But so many of our brothers and sisters are attacking us for daring to partner with people that they don't approve of. So it gets even worse.
While they are partnering with people that, are far outside the evangelical world. the question is, when are you compromising by? Because that's what the moral majority was, saying it's not just evangelicals. It's evangelicals because, again, Paul Weyrich was Catholic. Phyllis Schlafly was Catholic. So they were trying to pull socially conservative Catholics and socially conservative evangelicals into the same boat so they would row harder and have more political impact. Is that what he's advocating for?
I think so.
No.
What do you mean no?
What do you mean no, Caitlin? What do you mean no?
I mean, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, I think he's trying to make a distinction between making compromises that you shouldn't make for the sheer sake of political power, which often evangelical Christians have done, and saying we do have common cause with a variety of people and we should learn from others. We should be humble enough. I mean, to Skye's point in jest, like, we actually do believe as Christians that because we are fallen and finite creatures, we have some access to truth by the revelation of God and by natural revelation around us, but other people have access to some truth too, and we actually need to learn from them and collaborate with them to build a common community together. Sounds, if you say the right words, those two things can sound like the same thing, but I think they're actually pretty different things.
Yeah, but like he gives that example, I don't have it in front of me, but he gives an example in his article about conservative Christians partnering with feminists on, what was it, pornography? What was it? What were they partnering?
Yeah.
Right? Like they come at this issue for different reasons, but they have a shared interest in reducing access to pornography, especially that which exploits women. So great. Okay, fine. Let's work together on a shared goal, even though our motivations might be a little bit different or our reasons are different. Yeah. That's what has to happen when you no longer wield unilateral power in a culture. Right.
But there is, But where's the point where, though, you're also just making room for other points of view, where you're acknowledging pluralism, where it's not just you're saying, I think we can finagle a deal with the Catholics over there, and between the two of us, we can block, this, but saying, maybe the Hindu voice should be heard as well about zoning for mosques, instead of trying to get Catholics to join together with us to block zoning for mosques.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two levels to this. Like, he's focusing in this article on the tactical reason to be engaging in coalitions with people who are different from you. I think he would agree with a lot of Christians throughout history, at least in the last, couple hundred years where this was our reality, that there are also good principled reasons to believe that humans made in the image of God should have the ability to voice their deeply held convictions. But I also think he's pointing out that even if you are coming from a theological position that goes, no, this is what's true, and we shouldn't really care what other people think, you still have a tactical reason to care about this. Because increasingly, the battle lines are drawn in weird places. Like, if you want some things done that you think actually really serve vulnerable people, even if you are not ideologically in support for pluralism, which I think you should be, but even if you're not, there are tactical reasons for you to care about that.
Okay. Third change he's advocating for is one of posture. If we're in anger, we may have a fighting posture, head down, fists up. If we're bargaining, we prostrate ourselves before politicians who promise political scraps in return. None of these postures serve us well. Evangelicals need a new posture that will enable them to collaborate and contest, fight and forgive, persuade and listen. Okay? Agreed?
Like that?
Disagreed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He said fight. Are we supposed to fight?
It depends what the issue is and what the fight is.
Yes.
Okay. But I think what he's calling for here is agility and wisdom.
Yep.
It's not just a one size fits all. It's not always fight. It's not always prostrate. It's not always withdraw. It's not always engage. It's wisdom and discern what the situation calls for. Yeah, there you go. Agility.
Yeah, we need to be gymnasts. Okay. Number four. This leads us to the fourth change. The future of evangelical political engagement is going to require a profound renewal of the evangelical imagination. Somewhere, Karen Swallow Pryor just heard a bell ring. Ding! Evangelicals. Oh, and so did I. Maybe I'm Karen Swallow Pryor. Evangelicals will need to shift from a life of political consumption to one of cultural creativity. Rather than consuming endless hours of political vitriol via cable news, talk radio, and social media, we need to focus on, to put it frankly, becoming more interesting human beings.
Yes.
Now what is he
This
suggesting?
is my favorite point.
This is very Andy Crouchy.
What are you saying, sir? What's your accusation? Evangelicals need to throw more dinner parties, attend more poetry classes, take up woodworking. That's what America is missing. More woodworking Christians. And start book clubs or bowling leagues. We should serve refugee families or learn a new language, learn to cook, or throw a neighborhood picnic. Oh, come on. What good would that do?
Yes.
None.
Yes.
And
Phil.
We'll still lose the Senate seat.
This reminds me of the conversation I had with Sharon McMahon last week, where she was joking about, I mean, she didn't quite explicitly say this, but I think this a lot. We were talking about the like save democracy thing. And it does get so exhausting when everything online is like, do this and you will save democracy. And I think one of the things I've learned in the work that I've been doing with churches and like the conferences that I go to that are all focused on basically what he's saying, like renewing evangelical political imagination. A lot of them, the most effective things and the most fun things and the most interesting things are when churches said, we are hosting potlucks, or when churches said we're doing a game night, and then they were surprised by the relationships that produced, the creativity that it produced. Like, there are way more fun ways to care about our communities. And I've said this before on the podcast, but because I go around and talk about politics all the time, I'm so sick of going to places. I'm so sorry to anyone who's listening who did this to me while I was at your church or your school, but I'm so sick of going to places and the way they introduce me is like, everything's so hard and politics is so impossible and we all hate each other. But Caitlin is here to help us. I'm so sick of that because I'm like, there are possibilities for cultural creativity that are exciting and fun and meaningful. You're making it out to be that everything about this segment of our lives, which is most of our lives, this public communal sense, is just like polarized and awful and terrible. And there are parts of it that are, but like to just start off with the assumption that it's hard and it's bad cuts us off from these kinds of possibilities that he's talking about.
Caitlin, we're all soldiers with arms blown off and limbs lost, and you're Florence Nightingale, and you come along and you put us back together, and you get us back on our feet to go out and get our arms blown off again.
No,
that's what you're doing. No, okay. How? Describe what you're doing.
This was Sharon McMahon's, this was her recommendation too, was like, take care of the baby, bake the loaf of bread, do the good thing in your community. And I do think our democracy is actually better served by people who have right-sized their sense of what they can do in the world. If you are convinced that the weight of the world is on your shoulders, that you have to save democracy, you will actually end up doing the things that he talks about earlier in this article. You will end up cutting corners. You will end up making compromises you shouldn't make. You will end up steamrolling over other people who get in your way because you have to save democracy. If you right-size your sense of agency, not too small, actually. You don't have no agency. You're not helpless to the political forces around you, but you also don't have so much that you can change the world or save democracy. You will discover that there are really small, specific ways that you can get involved in your community that are meaningful. To give one example, in case anyone thinks that I'm lying, I was just talking to a pastor a few weeks ago who was involved in a local effort in their community to make sure that the public school down the street that was really well serving some under-resourced communities was not shut down because it was a purely financial decision. And actually that school was a like community center and beautiful things were happening there. And it was hard. It wasn't just like rainbows and butterflies and perfect and happy, but like it wasn't the exhaustion of arguing with strangers on the internet or of sending one more letter to your, congressional leader that is getting a bajillion letters. It was like show up at a meeting and have a conversation. And then after this school is saved, they could have a potluck in the garden outside. There's just possibilities for neighborhood and community that are not so life-sucking.
That's
Amen.
Kind of an inspiring vision, Florence. Sky.
One of the things he's getting at here is one of the characteristics of an idol is they're never content to stay in their lane. An idol always wants to be all-consuming and take over every part of your life. And for some of us, it's easy to make saving the culture war, the politics, whatever, becomes all-consuming, and it spills over its lanes or its container into every other part of your life so that you can't think about how to have a fun time with a neighbor without talking about it, or how to do it. Just it steals your joy away. And like for me, one of the things I wouldn't necessarily call this cultural creation, but an outlet for me is my improv team. Like just getting together with a group of people and laughing and having a fun time is life-giving. It's invigorating, and hopefully it brings joy to other people. And I don't know what anyone's politics are, and I don't care, and it's not about that. And so we need to get away from these idols that want to be all-consuming and destroy every other part of our lives, and recognize that we are multifaceted creatures with lots of different outlets, and we are called to bring joy and creation and vitality to other things in our life. And it doesn't all have to be one thing all the time.
Christians can also do stand-up comedy. They don't just have to do politics.
Exactly.
All the time. That's crazy. Do you know what our audience is saying right now, Sky?
What?
They're saying, hey, you've only mentioned 4 things. And he said there were 5. What's the 5th thing, Phil? Let me tell you. The final change for American evangelicalism brings us back to the heart of the gospel. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The center of evangelical politics must be the good news. The evangelical life begins with an experience of grace and gratitude, not fear, anger, or resentment. True? Is this true? True or false?
True.
I think we're
Caitlin
going with
says true
here.
Sky says true. Okay.
Yeah, it's I mean, a lot of people read Ann Voskamp's book about gratitude. I forget what it was called. But like it's just a foundational discipline of the Christian life. When we practice gratitude, it changes our outlook on things. And I think she's absolutely correct. So, yes, gratitude needs to be a foundational piece of our lives rather than anger and grief and outrage.
Okay. So that is, his name is Matthew Keming.
Yep.
He is the Associate Professor of Faith and Public Life at Fuller Theological Seminary. And this was in last month's Christianity Today in their Evangelicals in a Diverse Democracy series. Ooh, that's fun.
Which has some other great pieces too.
Other great pieces that I didn't notice. So, Caitlin, you should have been sending them in so I could see them and then we could talk about them, but it's going to be too late. So you better hurry up. Okay. Another story that we were going to talk about last week, but then I realized it was 3 boys. And 3 boys should not be talking about this story. In a first among Christians, this is in the New York Times, young men are more religious than young women. Dum, dum, dum. That is frickin' huge. All my life I've heard Christianity is so feminine. Christianity is so dominated by women. And then I'd hear, well, yeah, but it's kind of always been that way. Look at Augustine's mother and Constantine's mother and,
It's kind of always been that way.
Yeah, so it's okay. So stop. And then all of a sudden somebody says, wait a minute. It just flipped. This is as big. Caitlin, this is as big as the poles of the Earth flipping. The geomagnetic North Pole flipping, which might happen in the next 50 years, actually. And it's happened more than once in history that the poles actually have flipped. You don't think this is that big? You don't think this is that big, Caitlin?
I mean, it's significant. I want to talk about reasons why this could be happening and what the dynamics are. I do think there is data to back up a significant difference between Gen Z men and women. But to say that this is like a massive overhaul of the gender dynamics of the church, I think
changes everything.
Little bit of an overstatement.
Changes everything. Yeah. For the first time in modern American history, young men are now more religious than their female peers. They attend services more often and are more likely to identify as religious. We've never seen it before, Ryan Burge said, while running around in his front yard, setting things on fire with a large banner saying, "Take me now, Jesus." I made up that last part, but that was Ryan Burge who said that. Okay.
Yeah.
Church
membership seem like the yelling type.
Church membership. Oh, don't cross him. Church membership has been dropping in the United States for years, but within Gen Z, almost 40% of women now describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated, compared with 34% of men. What? In every other age group, men were more likely to be unaffiliated. The men and women of Gen Z are also on divergent trajectories in almost every facet of their lives, including education, sexuality, and spirituality. Young women are still spiritual and seeking, according to surveys of religious life, but they came of age as the Me Too movement opened a national conversation about sexual harassment and gender-based abuse, which inspired widespread exposure of abuse in church settings as well. And then the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. These are someone's theories as to why this is happening. And young men are worried about different things. They're less educated than their female peers. In major cities, including New York and Washington, they earn less than their female peers. At the same time, they seem to place a higher value on traditional family life. Childless young men are likelier than childless young women to say they want to become parents someday by a margin of 12 points. That's kind of big.
That's kind of surprising.
Yeah, that is surprising. Young men want to have families more than young women do. Caitlin, what the heck is going on? Speak for your generation. Unpack it.
First of all, this is not my generation.
It's your generation.
Younger than me.
Oh, who is this? Who am I talking about?
This is Gen Z.
Okay.
I'm barely not Gen Z.
Oh,
I do think this is important to note because the experience that I have of a variety of church traditions is still one of much more women being involved in church and attending church. That's also my other question about this data is how much it accounts for the depth of involvement in a church. I would not be surprised, and I have no idea if this is true, I would not be surprised if there were more men who claimed religious affiliation and who occasionally went to a church service, but how many of the women in those churches are significantly more involved than the men? I don't know, but I would just be curious for more data about that. My one thought is, people have pointed this out, right, that there are some gender reasons for people being previously involved in the church and then leaving, whether that's the abuse scandals, whether that's kind of a crackdown on complementarian restrictions on women in leadership, et cetera. And I don't think that tells the whole story because that's been going on for a long time. And if that was true, then women wouldn't have been the majority of people in churches for most of Christian history when they had very little access to leadership roles in the church. I do think there is part of that story that is true, though, which is that women have historically been like the backbone of churches in the sense that they kept things running. They got the potluck together. They were, on the logistic side of things, most of the time it's women running the church. Even today, if you go into a lot of churches, there will typically be, in my experience, at least, there's often like a handful of women who are not employed by the church, but you find out they clean out the fridge every week or they make sure there's napkins at the potluck. What's
okay. Oh no, I just have a question about that. I 100% agree. It's been my experience in the church too. Is that historically because there were more women who didn't have full-time employment, and so they had the margin to do that kind of volunteer engagement in the church?
Yes. Thank you for stealing my point away from me. I think that's part of it.
Right.
I think it's a combination of that women have been the majority of folks in the church, in part because Christianity, in spite of our very colorful recent flaws, have often dignified and honored women in contrast to the culture around them. So women have been the majority. Women have often been the backbone of things. And to your point, they used to have more margin for that. Now much more women are in school, are in the workforce, but also it used to be true that they didn't have access to leadership roles in the church and they didn't have access to leadership roles anywhere else. So it wasn't a big deal to say, when I show up at church, I'm running the potluck or I'm, an administrative assistant to a pastor or I'm behind the scenes. I'm not leading, I'm not preaching, I'm not teaching. That's fine. I'm not doing that anywhere else. Now, all sorts of other institutions are giving women visible leadership roles, and there are still many churches that do not. So I do think part of the story here is that where women used to find a greater sense of agency in the church in a world that didn't give them opportunities to serve in any significant way, even if they weren't in front, the church gave them an opportunity to nurture the faith of even men in kind of surprising ways, right? They ended up having great spiritual influence over others, even though they weren't preaching from the stage or serving communion to anyone. Now, though, that doesn't feel as dignifying and honoring as it once did because other places are dignifying and honoring them in much more visible and much more leadership kinds of ways.
Okay, I 100% agree with that assessment. It explains why women might not be engaging in the local church as much as they used to. They're a lot busier. They have careers outside the church. They have roles of dignity and influence outside the church in a way they didn't. Fine.
But, get to the but, Sky.
Here's the but. What's the explanation for the growth of young men in the church?
I have one. I mean, I might be wrong, but...
Okay, this is what I really want to get to.
There's a weird flip here, I feel like. Because in the past, part of why the church was so attractive to women, I think, is this sense of agency of you belong to a family and you have a role to play and you can use your gifts, albeit in limited ways, but you can use your gifts. And women now are less in kind of immediate need of that sort of thing. But a lot of the other data that Phil talked about when it comes to employment, when it comes to education, when it comes to moving out of your parents' house, all of that has shifted so that it's often young men who feel like they have no agency in the world, no place that they belong. Women, in my experience, and this could be transcultural or it could be very specific to our place, tend to just make those communities. In the church or outside of the church, they find ways to have community around them. Men, I think, struggle with that. And in the church, they've often relied on women creating that for them to engage in. If they don't have a way to create that, or that's not naturally what they're doing outside of the church, they're going to go to the church, and the church gives them a sense of agency. It gives them a sense of belonging and community. And to the statistic that Phil read about wanting a family, the church is a very pro-family organization, and they hope that that can be a structure. I mean, I think I'm pretty confident I'm the only one of the three of us that's like gone out on the dating app world, which is a scary, horrible place.
I hope you
are.
Young
men want to go to a church, and they're like, that's a place I can meet someone and get married and have children. The alternative that the world is giving me is not, here's another institution or another community where you can meet someone and have a family and have friends and support. If the other option is dating apps, I'm going to go to the church.
Okay. I got something to say, Sky Jitani. I got something to say. You also have the dynamic where, the make your bed, straighten up, fly right crowd like Jordan Peterson that started advising all of these lost young men and how to engage with their lives and how to actually be men are also talking more and more about church. Jordan Peterson's teaching the book of Exodus on the Daily Wire. So it's a lot of these kind of right-leaning, tough love, come on, guys, get it together, are becoming very traditional. They're also promoting family. Go find a wife, settle down, stop playing video games in your parents' house. And by the way, 20% of men between the age of 25 and 34 live with their parents, about twice the number of women that live with their parents. So we have a huge group of men that just aren't making it into life. And you've got voices that are coming out more and more. I mean, Charlie Kirk is doing the same thing. Come on, find a church, find a woman, have babies. So that for a segment of the male society, that's becoming a very popular message. And I don't know how much that's moving the needle, but it can't be ignored because those guys have, audiences of millions.
Yeah. I agree. And I think if there are young men out there who are struggling with a sense of purpose, a sense of community, a sense of maturity and responsibility, and they feel like the church is the place that's going to help me do that, good, great. That's a better alternative than some of the other options that might be out there. However, history has shown that when groups of young men gather together into communities, and those communities are dominated by young men rather than mixed gender communities where there is sort of the civilizing effect of female presence as well, it generally doesn't go very well.
Caitlin really didn't like that.
I know.
Turn of phrase.
But just statistically speaking, most of the problems in any society are caused by young men. I know Caitlin's looking at me. It's true. Look at the prisons. Look at crime rates. Most of it is driven by young men.
All right.
It's just a fact.
This is like turning into a classic debate. From Liberty University, we have Caitlin Shess. Caitlin Shess, do you believe that young men are responsible for most of the world's problems due to a lack of influence of the civilizing nature of the woman?
No. I mean, I 100% agree with Sky that if there is not mixed gendered communities and young men in particular, and you're right, young is an important part of this, like brain's not fully developed, weird hormonal stuff going on. Like, yes, bad things can happen. I also think part of the reason historically that's been true is because of who had access both to traditional forms of power, money, political power, and who had a narrative and could control the narrative about justifying the things that they did, giving stories that said it's fine, that it's chivalrous, right, for us to act in certain ways, or it's like the crusade that we're on is just for these kinds of stories. So I think that plays a big part in it. That's not innate. I think a lot of that is socially determined. And I do so much hate the like women are the civilizing force. Like men are just like brute strength and power, and women are like kindness and gentleness. And I don't think that is true at all.
I'm not,
and in fact,
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
Look at Sky.
What is the civilizing force that you mean?
Sky is brute strength and power. And Caitlin, you're just light and goodness.
Well, I mean, here, okay, this is perhaps an oversimplification. go to a college campus, a secular college campus, and go to a fraternity house and go to a sorority house. Do I think men and women are equally capable of depravity and sinfulness? Absolutely. But when you step into an environment that is completely dominated by young men, it is a nightmare. And when you walk into a community that's dominated just by young women, the nightmare is there, but it's under the surface, right? It's under the surface.
It is just as diabolical. I mean, it is evil sometimes.
But and this is where, when young men have to be in community with young women, they tend to take some of their worst instincts and at least put them under the surface or in check. And that, I'm not saying they don't have those terrible instincts, but there is a check on it that doesn't exist when there's only men around.
I think it can be worse when there is a cover for it all, when it is sort of secret and passive aggressive and the niceties are there. It reminds me of, you know, how people will always, not all people, but some people will say, sure, the husband is the head, but the wife is the neck and she can move. I think that's a pretty good description of how in a lot of evangelical churches, we've bought into some of what you're saying, and women have found secret, passive aggressive, really somewhat diabolical ways to wield power that have not been healthy for them or for the men in their communities. I totally think you're right that there are benefits to mixed gender communities, and that churches that are made of entirely young men would be really bad. But it's not because women are more virtuous or that the way that they manifest their sinfulness is any better. I think it's just that we were made in the image of God, and you need both man and women to fully image God in communities.
That's all I'm saying. I'm not in any way. In fact, I got into a conversation recently with somebody about this. Like, I am for women in leadership in the church. I'm kind of getting annoyed, frankly, with people who are playing this card like female leadership is inherently more virtuous than male leadership.
Yeah, it was me. You said that to me.
Yeah, I don't buy that. So I'm in agreement with you. Like, I'm not saying that women are intrinsically more civilized than men. I'm saying when men are not around women, especially young men, are not in community with women, it turns into the primate house at the zoo where they just want to look at their phones all day long and throw feces. Like, it's not a good scenario.
If you're going to disregard the reasoning you gave for this point, then I will let you concede that.
I am saying that when women are present in community with men, it's more civilizing. And I'm not saying that women are more virtuous. I'm just saying when the genders are together, it's better.
I would just say that genders are better together for distinctly Christian reasons, not for civilizing reasons.
I'm gonna call this on time. And I'm gonna say 2 points to Liberty University, 1 point to Miami of Ohio. But thank you for playing.
Okay, but Phil, back to your original point. If more young men are going into these churches and fewer young women are going to churches, does that trend lead to bad outcomes for churches?
Go back, 50, 70, 80, I don't know how far you have to go back. But colleges were all male, like 100% male. There were women's colleges. And, Harvard wasn't turning out just wave after wave of terrorists and gang members.
That's a good point.
Men were coming out that were civilized and then found a wife and then settled down and then had kids and built communities. And you can't just say, but colonialism, and then it overturns everything.
No, Phil, they also built very misogynistic societies.
They
did. Yeah. But Phil, you've made such an excellent point for why this is not about a civilizing better community. It's about a distinctly Christian community. Christian communities should have both men and women for Christian reasons of we better image God, we better glorify God, we better serve our communities and God when both men and women are present. There are very different reasons why colleges should not, or maybe should not, have been segregated by gender, but they obviously were not for civilizing reasons.
Yeah. There was, if you talk to people that went to church at Mars Hill under Mark Driscoll in the early years, many young men will say, it was really helping me become more responsible and think more about others. Like, there was a healthy aspect early on at Mars Hill that young men still talk about who were there that they miss. Then, of course, he went off leaving bodies behind the bus and went nuts. But there's something there.
That's a good example, Phil, because a young man learning to be responsible is just maturity. There's nothing uniquely Christian about that. You don't have to be a Christian to be a responsible adult male.
There is a distinctly Christian way to go about that.
Exactly.
But it was something that was happening in a church context. The church was the point, the place that was bringing men together and saying, what you're hearing from the world about, just being wealthy, not caring about women, not taking care of people, we say that's wrong. And this is what we believe is the better way to do it. And many men were responding positively to that, even from a jerk of a pastor.
Yes, okay, fine.
Caitlin.
I think to Caitlin's point, I'm not sure what we saw in Marsil was ultimately a Christian formation of masculinity.
Yeah, I don't know that it was. But it was men attracted to it for the same reason they're attracted to Jordan Peterson. Yeah. And many of them talked about in hindsight, that actually helped me grow up. That experience helped me grow up. Okay, Caitlin, how many points for Miami of Ohio and how many points for St. Paul Bible College of St. Bonifacius, Minnesota?
I don't think I can repeat that full name, but I will say 1 point to Sky and 2 points to Phil.
Okay, so I clearly have lost all battles here.
Although technically you ended with 2 points and so did each of us. So.
Oh no, 3 points to Phil.
I clearly need to go find a men's ministry to have my masculinity put back in place.
I think there's one of us who has never had a positive interaction with a men's ministry, and I think it's pretty clear which one of us it is.
Caitlin?
It's not Caitlin. No, it's not Caitlin. It's not Caitlin. Okay. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming along. Let us know what you think. Who do you agree with? The debate team from Miami of Ohio, the debate team from Liberty University, or the debate team from St. Paul Bible College? I know, but I'm going to say it anyway because it is true, Caitlin.
She also went to Dallas and Duke, and I also went to Trinity.
Yeah.
We have multiple
Caitlin,
alma maters
don't
here.
Pigeonhole us.
Hey, Caitlin, are you on the debate team at Duke?
No.
I was not on the debate team at Miami, Phil.
Sure you were.
I was not.
You debated atheists. You and Mike Erie would do stuff.
Yeah, but that wasn't a debate team. That was just for fun.
I'll just cry me a river. Okay, everybody. Thanks for coming in. Have a great week. Stay around for the guest. It's going to be great. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
The Holy Post is sponsored by the National Association of Evangelicals. Do you feel the tension in the air? Maybe it's at the dinner table or in your church or just anytime you hop on social media. In our increasingly divided country, disagreement has become hostility. So what's the role for Christians in this moment? How do we heal rifts and wrestle with complicated topics in a world that feels increasingly divided into sides and prefers simple sound bites over thoughtful engagement? The Difficult Conversations podcast, hosted by Walter Kim, president of the National Association of Evangelicals, shares incredible stories of people who have stepped out of safe circles, sometimes into enemy territory, to build bridges and repair relationships. You'll hear from experts on why difficult conversations are so hard, how to have them, and why they matter for the kingdom of God. In the first episode, Jonathan Haidt, one of the world's foremost thinkers in social psychology, starts at the beginning and helps us understand why we are just so polarized. Look for the Difficult Conversations podcast on your favorite podcast app.
A Bible professor once told me, when we read the Bible, the challenge is to know what we see and not simply see what we know. Said another way, we need to be careful that we don't read our own cultural values into the Bible. But unfortunately, that happens a lot. Steve Bezner is a pastor in Houston, Texas, and he came to realize that despite his church's ministries and the focus on Bible teaching, many of his church members were far more influenced by social media and cable news than by Christian values, and they were importing those American cultural beliefs into their faith and into their reading of Scripture. He's written a new book about this problem that includes practical wisdom about what to do about it. It's called Your Jesus is Too American: Calling the Church to Reclaim Kingdom Values Over the American Dream. Caitlin talked with Bezner about the book and especially how our American views of money, sex, and power have eclipsed what the Bible actually says. But Bezner says it's not enough to simply critique these problems in the church. We need to construct something better. And that's what I think you'll find most helpful and inspiring about their conversation. I think you'll walk away genuinely hopeful about what can happen when a church rediscovers our true calling. Here is Caitlin's conversation with Steve Bezner.
Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
I am honored and flattered to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just telling you, I finished reading your new book this morning. I love it. Would highly recommend it. Has a spicy title. Your Jesus is Too American, calling the church to reclaim kingdom values over the American dream. Talk to us a little bit just about this title, Your Jesus is Too American, and kind of your vision for this book. What would your kind of general description of what you're trying to do here be?
Yeah, even as we were kind of having our conversation, I was thinking a better title might have been Your Church is Too American.
Mm,
But I think it's that, we're all in the middle of our cultural contexts, and we can't help but be influenced by that. But I looked around I'm a pastor, and I looked around one day and I just kind of realized that the primary discipling influence in the life of most of my people was either social media or binging YouTube videos late at night,
mhm.
or cable news. And I just really started to think about how those cultural pressures are sort of forming us in ways that are opposite of the way that Jesus would ask us to be formed. And I really wanted to talk about that with my church. So this book started out as some sermons that
Mhm.
tried to point us back to the way of Jesus. And that's what I tried to do in the book, is I tried to just say, I really want us to think about what it looks like to not look at Jesus through an American lens, if that's even possible, and then to try to approach following Jesus from a lens of the New Testament as best we can in the
Mhm.
21st century.
Yeah, you tackle so many subjects in the book. I'm sad we don't have time to talk about all of them, but lots of different ways that we have been influenced by modern Western ideas, even outside of America. I thought like I would give this to some folks who are not American, but have learned a lot of these ideas as well. So we can't talk about all of it, but I want to talk about one experience you write about that I think a lot of folks in the audience can resonate with. We have a lot of pastors who listen, or people who teach Sunday school, or people who've been in the church for a long time. And in your chapter on money, you talk about preaching on the Bible and what the Bible says about money, and getting called a liberal or being accused of kind of preaching politics. And I think a lot of us can resonate with like, I'm trying to just say what the Bible says. And people are receiving that and kind of slotting it into a partisan box, or they have a preconceived idea about it.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience and maybe other similar experiences you've had, and just why you think we respond that way? Why we have this impulse to say, oh, I'm pretty sure, whether it's my pastor or a friend of mine or someone I know, they said this thing that they think is coming from scripture, and I think it must be coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest answer is because we don't set the terms of engagement for conversation, but we allow outside forces to set those boundaries. I think that right now we're in an election season, so it's pretty obvious that a lot of the conversations are set by political talking points. But I'm amazed at how even people who would say that they're not big into politics would also say similar sorts of things. I mean, they just allow the political talking points that people who are really into talking points kind of filter down, if that makes sense. And so I really feel like whenever people hear us talk about money in church, they're totally good with generosity. Like they love generosity. They say, oh, yeah, we want to be generous. They even are not opposed to the idea of being generous to ministries or to church programs. But when you start talking specifically about poverty, for whatever reason, I don't know why this is, but somehow material poverty and spiritual morality are often combined in the American context. And it has been really difficult for us to disentangle those and to really just acknowledge the fact that a lot of us were blessed to be born in a certain space or to have access to a certain education or a certain profession, et cetera. So, yeah, I really think that it's just those lines of discourse that we allow to be formed outside of scriptural norms.
Yeah, I have had a similar experience where there's times when I'll say something that I'm just pulling from biblical language. I don't give a chapter and verse, and someone has this visceral reaction to it. And I'm just sort of like, oh, I mean, I understand the visceral reaction. Scripture says a lot of things that I have, intense reactions to. It is provocative and it does
Hmm.
challenge me. But sometimes we're so stuck in the political context that we're in, the cultural context that we're in, that um, it sounds like a real threat. It doesn't sound like it comes from scripture. Um,
staying on a really light, chill topic after money, I really want to talk about your chapter on sex, because I found it so helpful in reorienting the conversation that we're having. So you spend this chapter on money, you talk about politics, we'll get to in a minute. But in this chapter on sex, you don't spend a lot of time on specific questions that we tend to like really fight about, like what you can do with who that we tend to fight about. You instead talk a lot more about intimacy and community. Can you talk a little bit about what our underlying theological failures are when it comes to sex? If we pick up some ideas about money and politics from the world that then shape how we read the Bible and what we receive from the Bible, what are some of those things that we've gotten wrong when it comes to sex specifically, but as I said in your chapter, much more broader questions than even just those questions about sex?
Yeah, it might actually, Caitlin, be helpful to step back to money for just a second, because I think that like I really feel as if John the Baptist, when he says, if you have 2 cloaks, give to the one who doesn't have. And when Jesus stands up and says, I'm here to proclaim good news to the poor, the signs are there in Scripture all along, but we have this spiritual way of reading the text. And so whenever Jesus says, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, we start with an idea, well, it's good news for the poor because even without money, you can receive salvation in Christ, rather than a community of people would be so transformed that they would be generous to those who are without. So I think that same sort of hermeneutic gets applied to the sex conversation, because really when you look at the New Testament as a whole, it's pretty clear that God is creating a new family and a new way of relating to one another that is intended to transcend sexual relationships. And I think that the problem we have is that we cannot envision a way of relating to a person that goes beyond sex. So, as someone who's been married now for 25 years, I think I can say this fairly definitively. I'm grateful to have had the gift of sex in my marriage, but I can tell you it is nowhere near the best part of marriage. Now, the night before I got married, I probably would have disagreed with that statement, but I will tell you that the longer I'm married, the more that I realized, I'm grateful for the gift of sex, but it is not the best part. And the best part is the deep relational intimacy of knowing someone and being fully known. And to me, that's really the goal of our walk with the Lord, is to understand Him, for Him to know us, for us to recognize that we're known, and the church is intended to reflect that. So I really just think that what we've ended up doing is we have, again, accepted the way that the world wants to approach these sorts of relationships and has said, well, sex is the ultimate expression of what it means to be a human, rather than saying, the ultimate expression is having a deep level friendship and truly knowing and being known, and then walking in those kinds of terms instead. So that's kind of the basic approach I was trying to take in that chapter.
Yeah, I loved that so much, because I do feel like, regardless of whatever particular conversation you're having about sexual ethics, in different parts of the church, the conversation is different and what questions are most talked about are different. And yet I found that tends to be the common problem, is we're obsessed with sex, and we tend to think, whether we're saying some people can or can't have this, we tend to think this is the pinnacle of human experience and life. Can you talk a little bit more, both when it comes to money and when it comes to sex, about how the church as a community plays into that? You started your answer that way a little bit, but I'm just imagining some people going, most of my experience of the church when it comes to those two things, those are my worst two experiences. Either I feel like I'm manipulated when it comes to tithing, or I watch churches abuse the money that they're given, or when it comes to sex, variety of bad messages that I could hear that were really damaging. I think sometimes the impulse might be the church is the problem in this. Can you talk a little bit about how the church meets us in those difficulties that we've had, or maybe a different way that we could think about how this community handles these questions?
Yeah, I think that if we will not imagine of a new way of living, then we will fall into the way of living that the world offers us. And so with regards to, let's start with the topic of sex. I think that with that particular topic, what we end up doing is we assume that that is the ultimate expression of humanity because that's what the current conversation surrounding sexuality is, rather than thinking to ourselves, well, what does the Bible tell us that the ultimate expression of humanity is? Well, it's union in Christ. And then it's this idea that we can truly love and be loved and that we can know one another. And as you have those sorts of fulfilling relationships, I think anyone who has been single that I've talked to who's walked with the Lord, they have found deep relationships and deep friendships to be, I would say, a ministry unto themselves. And they give you a new imagination for how to envision the church and to really think that, the church can be something that is completely fresh, completely different, and doesn't necessarily sit outside of our own concerns, but it allows us to think about those concerns in a new way. I think I give an example in the book where I was talking to a young man who, he just thought, well, I hope that the Lord comes back and I get to see that, but I hope it happens after I get to have sex.
Relatable feeling to have.
Right. I
feel like I heard that all the time in youth group.
Absolutely. I think that people said that all the time. And the thing I realized was just that I had failed as a pastor to not explain that the ecstasy we will experience in union with Christ at the return of Jesus one day will far outweigh anything that we might ever know in sexual union, because as with many of our human experiences, they are intended to be a foretaste of what we will know one day in glory whenever we come into contact with the Lord. So I think that is one of the problems that we've faced, is we have not used human experience to be a signpost toward the ultimate. And again, that kind of plays towards money, because I think that the idea of money being a reflection of God's generosity towards us and what the kingdom will be like, in which we will share with one another and work for the greater good of all and for the redemption of creation, but then we will share that with the Lord and with one another, ought to be the picture that we have in the church, rather than some sort of manipulation to say, well, we have to build the best thing here, have the biggest thing here. Instead, we can say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We hope that you'll join us in that. We intend to share this with the community. We also want to be generous with those in our community who are less privileged or who have need. And that, to me, gives us a signpost that we can use to say, this is going to look like the kingdom one day. So I just think money, sex, and the rest of those ethical ideas ought to point us towards the ultimate, but most of the time we simply point back to a limited human experience.
Yeah. Not to just add another hot button thing to the sex and the money, but you have a whole chapter on another thing we're not supposed to talk about, politics. And I loved this chapter, and I loved that the kind of frame that you used throughout it was that we need to have this prophetic approach. And I would love to hear you describe that a little bit, because I think some people, when they hear prophetic, we can have a kind of romanticized idea of that. Like, some of us want to be prophetic because we're like, I would love to flip some tables. I would love to wave my fist at power, etc. And that's not totally how you describe it. And I think it could be really helpful for people to hear not only what does it mean for us to have a prophetic approach to politics, but what are things that it doesn't mean, or what are pitfalls we might fall into, whether we're trying to be prophetic or we're trying to change the culture, or whatever we're trying to do. We might go in with good intentions and find ourselves in a wayward path.
Yeah, I love the MLK quote where he talks about the fact that the church is intended to be the conscience of the state. And I really believe that if we will think of prophecy as something that's intended to build up rather than simply to rebuke, then we end up on a much better path. I think that in the social media age, many of us have grown quite adept at rebuking. We have grown quite flaccid, I would say, in our attempts to actually build something. So a lot of us are really proficient at criticizing, but we're not good at constructing. And I think that one of the things that the church does now, not to sound too much like particular schools of theology, but I think that we get to build an alternative. We get to say, this is a different way of living. One of the things that I love about, the Bruderhof, the Bruderhof community has a book that says another way of life is possible. And I think that that is really kind of the core idea of the church, to be able to say, I think that we have the opportunity to live in a way that is completely unique. And whenever we choose to live in this way, we can cast a fresh vision. So politically speaking, I think that it's not just about us rebuking, but then it's also living in a way that demonstrates. Now, if you take our criticism seriously, you'll actually see something that's real over here on this side.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's in that chapter or a different part where you say people criticize Christians for not knowing what we're for, only what we're against, or not talking about what we're for, but only what we're against. And you're like, I'm not sure that we know what we're for. Which brings me to something I was thinking about throughout the whole book. I love how you've described these places where we have confused something that is American for something Christian. It's syncretistic. And I think it's easy sometimes for people to look at other folks who do that and go like, oh, I can identify how your patriotism has become an idol, or I can identify how your politics has become an idol. But in our own lives, I think it's really hard sometimes that's part of the thrust of the book is like, we're confused about what is Christian and what is American. How would you counsel someone listening who's going, yeah, some of the things you've talked about are things I've identified in churches in the past. How do I identify where we might go wrong in the place I'm in now? Some of these seem like pretty perennial issues when it comes to sex, when it comes to money and politics, but how do I know when I've adopted something that I think is a Christian value and it actually isn't?
Yeah, really is the $1 million question. And I don't know that I can answer it definitively, but I do think that once I decided that the kingdom of God was the ultimate lens, and that the Sermon on the Mount was not some sort of throwaway ideal, but was actually Jesus's, for lack of a better term, manifesto, to say this is the life in community, and then to read the rest of the New Testament with that lens, that there was an attempt to build a new community that would be a signpost pointing towards the eternity that would come in whenever Jesus returned. Once I started to think in those terms, it really became my new lens for just thinking about church, thinking about walking with the Lord. So, for instance, we've already talked about money, sex. We didn't really talk about power. So I think that that's a pretty good one for us to think about, because I think that power is one of those things in the United States, just in the world in general, in which we're always trying to gain. We're always trying to get influence over others, to lord it over others. And Jesus consistently talks about serving. It's his last act before he goes to the cross. He washes feet. Then you see Paul pick up that thread. Don't think of others, or don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought. You see him talking about treating yourself with humility, lifting others up, serving others, bearing one another's burdens, etc. Clearly, that's a concept that's been turned upside down. So I think, to go back to your original question, I think that what I have to do is I have to ask, what are the things that, as I look at my life, if I do a true self-examination and I hold it up against the big picture items in the New Testament, I'll say, this seems to be definitely out of whack. Now, I couldn't sit here and tell you I have all the answers or the solutions. We do live in a very real culture. It's not always easy to know how to step outside of that or to create something that's entirely different or new. But all that being said, I think that if I'm willing to do the self-examination to hold up just my way of life against the New Testament, then I will, I think, on a regular basis, find places where I say, I care way too much about being in power, or I care way too much about being wealthy. And I have to look at the diagnosis and the prescription given to me in the New Testament. And so if it's power, then I have to be willing to serve, because that does a work in my heart. If it's wealth and I'm greedy, then I have to be willing to be generous, because that does a work in my heart, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that answers your question, Caitlin, but that's kind of where I start.
No, and I appreciate you too saying some of it's not just we get the right ideas. It's like I have to do some things regularly. I need my community to help me. I need to, I know I have experienced very often. I tell people all the time who will ask me, they're early in seminary or they want to go to seminary, like, how do I keep from being, a seminary bro or being like, a theology bro. And I'll often say, like, I think one of the things that kept me the sanest during seminary was that I worked with kids. And it just, like, the practice of doing that helped me identify where I was getting prideful or big-headed. And I could know in my head I shouldn't be prideful and that knowledge puffs up. But it's a different thing to, like, actually have a practice in my life that helped me stay sane and helped me realize what I really don't know. Because when little kids ask you tough questions, you realize all the stuff you don't know. Steve, I think a lot of people listening have had really negative experiences with the church. And I think there's something already really powerful about them hearing not just someone, because we have a lot of folks on the podcast that will come on and talk about some of the things we've talked about, how the church has gotten money wrong and sex wrong and politics wrong. But I think it's important for them to hear from a pastor who's saying that. Can you speak a little bit to the folks that are thinking, one, maybe this is just a problem with the church. Maybe this is irresolvable. Like, it's great that you've identified these things. Maybe they can't be fixed. And two, who might be thinking, maybe the best way for me to follow Jesus more faithfully is to get myself out of the church because of everything that's really hard about it. What would your response to those folks be? Because I know for myself, I can resonate with why they might feel that way.
Yeah, so I am a pastor, which I guess sort of tips my hand, but I think that the first thing I would say is I would never question that anyone has had negative experiences. I've been around church and church people long enough to know that that's certainly real, and people have certainly had those experiences. But that being said, I think I would say sometimes the reason we've had those kinds of negative experiences is twofold. One, sometimes I think, and I put myself in this group, I've just had unrealistic expectations of the church. Like, I have expected the church to hold to the ideal it preaches in a way that is simply impossible. So I know I'm probably sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but what I'm trying to say there is that I know that I do my very best to be a pastor, and I also fail on the regular. And I try to extend grace to the people who are part of my church, and I know that they do the same to me. And I think that honestly is one of the best things that we do, is we extend grace to one another. But that being said, then I do think that the other piece would be to probably, that kind of the second side of that would be to look for a church that probably is not the church that you would gravitate towards naturally. And what I mean by that is that I think that most of us probably start out looking at the largest church in the area, or maybe the flashiest church in the area. And my church is a fairly large church. I'm not against large churches. I just think that those are the places where people who have been hurt probably tend to point. And I think that, again, not always, but I feel like churches that are a little more neighborhood focused, that tend to fly under the radar, tend to be the place where some of these things that we're talking about today are able to be practiced in a way that's healthier. The struggle with that is they're not always going to have the best young adult program or the greatest, program for your kids or your students. It becomes a much more communal village type enactment of the faith. But having been a part of those sorts of churches in the past, I think there's a real beauty there and a true opportunity to really see Jesus lived out in a healing way. So I don't doubt that the church has hurt people, and I know that's real. But I would also say that the church can be part of your healing if you'll just lean into it. I know that that's been part of my story. I think it's been part of your story. Is that if you find that kind of a community, it can be a very powerful force in your life.
Yeah. And one of my favorite things about the book is that there's not this like explicit argument for the church, but there is this implicit argument, because throughout every chapter where you're acknowledging, here's where our churches have gotten things confused. Here's where we've picked up values and ideas that were counter to the way of Jesus. You also have all these stories of churches doing things really well, not perfectly, like you said, still with fallen people in a fallen world, but really well. Can you talk a little bit about some of the practical ways that your church served people in your community during Hurricane Harvey. I want to talk a little bit about some other examples in a minute, but just give us some imagination, because I think for some folks, part of what's hard about this is if they have been in a really profoundly harmful church situation, they don't have examples that are coming to mind very easily. And maybe it's a media question too. They're not hearing the stories of churches being really faithful. Give us some examples that we might learn from, not because your church is a perfect church or you're a perfect pastor, but because I think those are good examples of why this isn't something we're doing by ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're on it. I think that service for us as a congregation has been the number one door towards a healthier church. Because whenever we are focused outwards, I'm a Bonhoeffer guy, so I'll drop in a Bonhoeffer quote, but the church is the church when it exists for others. That's what he said. And I think that as the church points towards others and as we serve others, we actually discover our identity and who Jesus created the church to be. And I actually think it helps us relate to one another in a more healthy way, because rather than pushing for influence and the ability to lord over a set of structures or an organization, it's really more just that we are serving side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and it really creates a healthier environment. So in our church in 2017, the city of Houston was hit by a massive natural disaster, Hurricane Harvey. 51 inches of rain fell across a few days. So much rain that it actually lowered the Earth's crust. Our church campus was flooded and essentially destroyed. And our neighborhood around us had feet of water that were in the homes. And one of the, I guess, just really knee-jerk decisions we made in that moment was that instead of focusing our primary efforts on rebuilding our church campus, we would go into the community. So we had a small team that stayed behind, but no exaggeration, 99% of the church that was serving went into the community and started pushing water and mud out of homes and cutting out old flooring and cutting out cutting out old drywall. And then we got a laundry service going at the church where people were washing clothes for people who had lost their washers and dryers. And then we started preparing meals and all these sorts of things. And in that, I just really feel like the church remembered who we were supposed to be from the beginning. And I really think that it doesn't have to be in the wake of a natural disaster, but if you are part of a church and you want to find the healthiest expressions of that, most of the time I would imagine it would be in the ministries that are serving the poor, the outcast, that are looking into the community and trying to help those who are in need. Because to me, when you walk among the poor, whenever you walk among the people in need, then you experience God, because that's where He is. And I really think that's where the healing begins in the church.
Yeah, I loved the story you told in the book about someone from your church being, I think, at like a Home Depot or something and seeing someone buying materials to do the work they needed to deal with the effects of the hurricane on their house, and asking like, oh, do you want some help doing that? And they were like, oh, no, someone from your church is coming to do it. I was like, that's amazing that not only like that moment of going like, oh, she already knows that this church is already helping her, but even the fact that this was a story where someone in your church just saw someone who was not asking for help and just volunteered to help them. That's like a culture that I think some of us are just hungry for. We want to exist in a community that works that way, and we want that to be true of us. And I love how the book gives us really vibrant examples of that. Another place that the book gives us an example of your church and other churches is in the relationships we have with people who are not Christians. Can you talk a little bit about how that has shaped your church in positive ways too? Because that's another place where on some level, there's folks listening who are like, that's the hardest thing I can imagine when it comes to what you've just described of like outward service to the community is I'm scared to have conversations with people who are theologically, religiously different from me. And that's also a place where I think a lot of us have seen the church do it really poorly. Can you talk a little bit about how that has shaped you as a pastor and your church?
I think that the best way to argue for or apologize, you use the apologetics term for your faith, is to actually engage with people in love and to serve side by side, because people then see that you actually believe what you say you believe. I really think that we have gone far afield when we focus primary energies on theological arguments alone. I mean, again, I know, Caitlin, I'm preaching to the choir here. You care about theology. I care about theology.
Yeah.
But people believe you whenever they see you serving and using that. So I know that in our community in Houston, one of the largest Muslim populations in the United States, and we have just decided that the best way for us to engage our Muslim neighbors is to serve and to love, and not necessarily to lead with preaching and theological debate. And one of my favorite things that we've done together is that we have decided that we need to start a community garden that we can do together, and that we can take food, fresh produce into food deserts in our city. And one of the things that we did together was we did some hurricane relief together. And as we do those things, what ends up happening is then that theological conversations happen by the way. Well, what's your motivation for doing these things? So, not to get too far afield, but the Muslim motivation for doing good works and the Christian motivation for doing good works have some similarities, but also have a lot of difference. Rather than kind of an earning perspective, we have very much a response perspective. And just those kinds of conversations have led to incredible sorts of results in our congregation. And I think that's just a tiny example, but you could see that in churches and in situations all over the U.S.
Yeah, that's so helpful. One last thing, Steve, that I think some people listening might be thinking, like, I love this. I love Steve. Maybe I should go to his church. But they also might be thinking, like, I know of some churches that I think have been really captive to political idolatry, have really gone on a path away from the way of Jesus towards all of these really American dream kind of values. And I don't have a lot of hope for that community or for my family members that belong to a church like that or that believe these things. And maybe one thing I can do is give them this book or talk through with them some of the things you've talked about. But I just wonder if you have any words of encouragement for folks that are like, I'm with you. Is there any hope for the American church? And not just in the abstract. There's like American church in the abstract. And I think a lot of people who are despairing over that are also despairing over an aunt or a friend or a pastor that they went to seminary with and thought we were on the same page, and now we've gotten so far apart. What would you say to someone who's kind of despairing over the state of the American church?
Well, first of all, I understand, and I join you in your despair in many respects. At the same time, I do think that there are a lot of great churches out there. Again, I just don't know that they're the ones that get the most attention.
Sure.
I think that sometimes those of us who hold high standards on organizations are also people who tend to be type 1 folks. Or type A folks, we tend to be very organized. And I know that this may be surprising and sometimes painful to hear, but sometimes the unorganized churches or the less organized churches are actually the ones that major in the relational aspects. And that might be the piece that we need to understand. And I really think that might be where the hope of the church can be found. The other piece I would also say is that I don't know that arguing over Thanksgiving dinner with whoever about the future of the church is your best plan. You may end up in that, but I do think that it's sort of like the witness that I talked about at the beginning of this conversation to the outside world, which is constructing an alternative reality. So I think that whenever, as a evangelical pastor in Texas, whenever we decide we're going to live in a way that's different, not only from the world, but honestly, some other churches, I think that there are some people who say, okay, wait a minute, that's different, that's unique. So I think that if you're part of a church that you can model that, I would encourage you that it actually may be more influential than you would suspect, and that people are watching. And social media gets used for ill all the time, so you can use it for good by saying, hey, my church is doing this, or my small group or Sunday school class is doing this, and we're participating in this. We got through reading the Sermon on the Mount, and we really felt compelled to do this. As we model service and love and that kind of rich community in the public square, I really think that it calls people and draws them into a more authentic version of the faith.
Thank you, Steve, for that. And as a little plug, On holypost.com right now, there's a story that Emerson Slaughter wrote about a small church that, like, someone who's connected to the Holy Post world was looking for a new church, found a neighborhood church, super small place, puts flowers on the altar, and has breakfast every week with the men in the church. And that's the whole story. The whole story on that page is just like, look at this little church doing good things. And I wish that we talked more about those stories, because I know there's lots of them. Steve, thank you so much for your work in this book. And thanks for your time today.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate it. And appreciate your insights, Caitlin.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.